Hello, my name is Dennis Turner. I'm an emeritus professor from the University of Dayton School of Law, and today I'm going to talk about gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is a term that is much used, but much misunderstood. So that is going to be the topic of the day. But at first I thought I'd have to start off with a shout out for the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is celebrating its 100th anniversary, and the League has for 100 years been promoting voting and doing what they can to encourage more voters, and they're doing it up to this day, registering people to vote and encourage them to going to the polls. So I did want to give a little shout out for the League of Women Voters. It's the 100th year anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, voting rights for women. And it is an appropriate time again because they fought for many, many years to earn the right to vote. But in some respects, that right to vote is being nullified by gerrymandering. And that is what we're going to talk about today. So we've heard a lot of talk about voter suppression. We know that there's been an attempt to suppress voters with voter ID requirements, roadblocks to registering, and voter roll purges, where someone who may have voted relatively recently gets purged from the polls, so when they go to the poll, they're told whether they're not registered. So that's voter suppression. Gerrymandering is different. Gerrymandering is really a form of suppression by stealth. It is a way in which it appears that you are able to exercise your right to vote, but that in reality, your vote won't count. It's almost like if you voted and instead of putting your ballot in the ballot box, you put it in the trash can. That's the effect of gerrymandering. It gives you the illusion that your vote counts, but in reality, it does not. A little bit of background. Every 10 years, there's a census, and there's one going on now. And one of the purposes of the 10-year census is to get a snapshot of the number of people in the U.S. and how those people are distributed throughout the country. And with respect to the legislative process, the census provides a way of helping recreate legislative districts that account for the change in the population. Some states have more people, less people, people in different locations, and the census will help those who are going to redraft or redraw the legislative districts to figure out how to do that. In theory, the goal of redistricting and drawing the maps is that each district will have approximately the same number of people as every other district in the country. So a big assumption in this process, in this redrawing, this redistricting process, is that if voters are more or less equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, for example, then the number of elected legislators would be more or less reflect that division. For example, if there was 53% Republican versus 47% statewide split, and the state is entitled to 16 congressional districts, you should figure that 9 of those congressional districts would be Republicans and 7 Democrats. And in independent voters in close races could tip that scale a little bit. So you could go from 10 to 9 or 9 to 8. And so that would be a relative balance between the districts. However, by manipulating the boundary lines of the districts, one could end up with 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. Or you could end up with 10 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And that is the art of gerrymandering. So who controls the redistricting process, the redrawing of these district lines? Generally, it's the state legislature, may include the governor, may include the Secretary of State, may include some other statewide office. Now, the real goal of gerrymandering is to protect incumbent legislators. And if you figure how an incumbent legislator is there to redrafting a district, they're going to want to redraft it or redraw it in such a way that their reelection is assured, so that it protects incumbent legislators. The ideal redrawn district would be, it wouldn't make any difference how the independents voted. If it was a completely safe district, then it wouldn't make any difference who the independents supported, because you can be assured that you're in a safe district. Your supporters are always going to outnumber the votes of the opposition. So gerrymandering is as old as the country. It got its name in Essex County in 1812 in Massachusetts. There was a scheme to protect an incumbent state senator by the name of Elbridge Gerry. So Massachusetts legislature wanted to redraw his district in such a way that he would be essentially guaranteed a re-election. It was a journalist who coined the word, because this is sort of the map of that gerrymandered district. You can see that they sort of maneuvered the towns around in such a way that the district they created favored him. His supporters were increased and his opposition were decreased. And the journalist who looked at this district suggested that it looked like a salamander. Now, I'm looking at this and I can't quite see how he got a salamander out of it, but anyway, he said it looked like a salamander, and so they added the word Geary to mander, and they came up with gerrymandering, but they ended up pronouncing it gerrymandering with a soft G. So that's how the word came about. So initially, gerrymandering is an art form. In other words, it's a lot of educated guessing to figure out just where the powers of the voters reside. So educated guessing is the politicians would sit down and try to figure out which precincts, which wards lean toward one party or the other, which are sort of independent or kind of always toss-ups, and how do we put those parts together in such a way to protect the incumbent. If we can move them around, move one into one district and another into another district, we can then ensure the election of the incumbent. However, recently, the impact of computers and big data, in which we know everything about everybody, about their likes, dislikes, and their politics. I mean, it's just an amazing amount of information is available. The guessing game has been turned into an exact science, orchestrated by computer nerds. They can manipulate the data to get amazing amount of information to figure out who is where and who are they likely to vote for. This became a real world situation in 2011 in Ohio, when again, after the census of 2010, there was going to be a redrafting of the legislative districts. A group of Republicans in this case, because Republicans controlled the legislature and the governor's office, went into what they even called in this hotel room the bunker. They went into the bunker and they got the computer nerds in and they did the manipulation, and they said, here's how the district, to maximize the number of Republican legislators elected, here's how you draw the districts. And they came out of that room with the maps that are now in existence, and they presented it to the legislature, and the Republican legislature says, oh yeah, okay, that's great. And that was it. So they essentially, the computer nerds decided, here's how we draw the districts to maximize the number of Republican representatives in the Senate and the House, and also in congressional districts. So with this big data, the computer nerds can slice and dice a district so precisely. They could literally insert one neighbor and slice out his next door neighbor. They could draw the line almost along the back fence. and say, well, we want that voter in that district and this voter in this district, so they can literally put them in different districts. So talking over your back fence to someone, they would say, well, I'm in district so-and-so. And they say, well, I'm over in this district. And that's how precise the information can be. So gerrymandering also might apply in other situations. And Phil gave me this one, so I had to include it. It could be used to do school districts in such a way that so that the Terror twins, Jesse and Billy, will now be riding in the bus to the Westview district. Amazing. I never know you could gerrymander school routes. I'm sure there's some school route drivers that would love to gerrymander their route to avoid some of the kids that they have to transport. So what is the mechanism, the main mechanism for creating a gerrymandering district? Well, here we have 3 examples, and there are 4 districts in each. Let's take a look at this district first. This is a district in which each square, there's 4 districts, each square has 8 blue and 8 red figures representing the population in that district. Now, as you would expect, in an election, the voters are pretty evenly divided in all those districts. And in any one election, a change of a few votes can alter the outcome of the election. You might get all 4 one party, all 4 the other party, 3-1, 2-2, but it's pretty much up to grabs. And then when you throw in the independents into that mix, then there's a whole lot of changes, a whole lot of variation that you could occur in that district. In the middle district is the same proportions of individuals, blue and red, the same number that exists in the original one, the first one, but they are maneuvered and the boundaries are maneuvered in such a way that they pack. This is called packing. And you can see that what happens here is that in this district, they have packed most of the red voters. Most of the red voters are packed in that district, so you're going to get a red elector out of that one. But what that means is in the other districts, the red are always going to be outnumbered by the blue. And so you've guaranteed in this way of packing that 3 of the representatives will be blue and 1 will be red. That is one methodology for gerrymandering. And the third example, and that is called cracking. And in this example, you take a somewhat different approach. So now what you want to do is you want to split up the voters in one party, spread them around in such a way as that you create a majority parties in 3 of them, a disbalance or a misbalance of 3 districts, and so you end up in the way it's designed here, you end up with 1 blue representative and 3 red representatives. These are the same number of blue and red squares as in that first example. But by maneuvering them around, you can assure that 3 of them will be red and 1 blue. So that is the primary way in which gerrymandering is achieved. Let's look at some Ohio congressional districts. This is a little bit of a hunt and find that you do. This is Ohio congressional districts as they exist right now. Can you find the snake on the lake? Near the top of this map, you can see that one of the districts snakes along Lake Erie. It just kind of snakes from Toledo all the way close to Cleveland. And that's what has been termed by some people the snake on the lake. They have maneuvered it such a way to create a safe district there because they have cut out parts of Toledo, parts of Cleveland, and then they sort of maneuvered that through. The other one is what I would call the woodpecker. This is Representative Jordan's district, and you have up near the top the woodpecker's head and then down the tail of the woodpecker. You can see his district extends a whole lot of way, all through those counties. So in the Ohio 1st Congressional District, you have a different approach. You have what I would call a very creative cracking job. There's Hamilton County. Where are the Cincinnati folks in this picture? Look how Hamilton County is divided. They have taken part of Hamilton County and the people of Cincinnati, they've moved them onto the west side, and then they've created this little umbilical cord that connects up to Warren County. And then for just a little added assurance, they've taken a little bit of appendix down here to create District 1. So they have half of Cincinnati in this district. And then the other district, they've got a tail, the other district, and they've connected the Cincinnati folks with Claremont, Highland, and Brown County. This is called cracking, right? They've split the voters of Cincinnati. So one might speculate as saying, well, how does that work? I mean, what are the interests of the Cincinnati folks? I mean, are their interests going to be shared with Claremont and Highland and Brown and that, or do they have another interest? If you didn't have cracking, Hamilton County, that first district, would be Democratic. I mean, by and large, Hamilton County is more Democratic than any others. But by cracking, they've able to keep no Democrats be elected out of Hamilton County. So that's a creative cracking job. So what are the consequences of gerrymandering in terms of the larger electoral concerns? So in this example, I have a woman who is trying to think, how do I get reelected? Where do I have to be reelected? And in this example, I've divided it into pretty much a balanced district with half the people on the more conservative side and half the people on the more liberal side. And just to show you where the fringes are, I have the neo-Nazis on one side and the communists on the other, because every group has their fringe group. So she's trying to think, how do I get reelected in this district? Well, how moderate do you think this candidate's views will be? You would rightly assume that her views have to be somewhat in the middle of the spectrum, because she's going to need votes from the right side, from our position, of the spectrum. She's going to need votes from over here in order to get elected. So what does gerrymandering do? This is the gerrymander axe. It comes in and it axes off people on this side of the spectrum out of the district. So that changes her view as to what her positions would be. Who does she have to curry favor with? I don't have to worry about these folks over here. I got to worry about the folks over on this side. I have to reflect more of their views, because what happens if I don't is they're going to label me a moderate or a closet liberal, and they're going to run somebody against me in the primary, and I'm going to lose the primary unless I reflect more of those views more toward the fringe side. And so a very few number of voters in the primaries will determine who the nominee is. But once that nominee is nominated, then that nominee is guaranteed election in the general election, because the district has been gerrymandered. And so what happens is you get people with the more radical views being nominated, and then those taking those radical views into the legislature. So that's one of the consequences of gerrymandering. It polarizes our electors. The theory with regard to democracy is supposed to represent and reflect the will of the people. And what gerrymandering does is it undermines that principle of democracy, because it is supposed to be government by the people, for the people. And it is an attractive theory, but again, gerrymandering stifles that voice of the people. Essentially, incumbents can be deaf to the voice of the people because they don't depend on that. So for example, suppose the out party garners 55% of the votes in a state, but only wins a third of the seats in the legislature because of gerrymandering is assured that most of those folks are in safe seats and they don't worry about those other voters. Let me give an example of that. So we have a group of people, and I think this is a fairly representative percentage and represents an issue that is certainly on the front burner as far as Ohio is concerned, and that is the regulation of feedlot farm runoff. I would say that probably 60% of the people would favor some regulation of farm runoff. So you have that group, and then on the other side you have the don't regulate group, and let's say they represent about 40% of the electorate. So when you go to the state legislatures, you would say, well, here is the group of senators wanting regulation, the group of 4, and there's the group of state legislators opposed to regulation. So under our theory of democracy and representatives reflecting the will of the people, you would say, well, let's vote those legislators out. We'll just vote them out of office. We'll vote against them. So you have a vote and you introduce the new state senate. It's the same. It's the same people. You have the 4 who are opposed and the 4 who want some sort of regulation. You don't change the number of people in the legislature, which is a fundamental aspect of democracy. So proposed reforms. A number of states have been trying to do something about gerrymandering. One proposed reform is what I would call begone politicians. Let's take the politicians out of the mix. Let's not have the people who have the interest in getting reelected redrawing the districts. Let's get them out of the mix. The other changes that are being proposed is what I would call mandatory guidelines. So let's also include certain mandatory guidelines about how you draw these districts up so that you can't have the snake on the lake or the woodpecker. You've got to have some consistency among these districts. So the underlying theme of these proposed reforms is removing the politicians from the redrawing process. One methodology is to create an independent commission of citizens to redraw the maps. They are not necessarily associated with any particular party. They may be academics, they could be statisticians, there could be a number of things. Then they would redraw the maps. But if you can't get the fox out of the henhouse, at least remove the fox's teeth with mandatory guidelines on how the district should be withdrawn. What would be the fairest approach? The fairest approach would probably be to have an independent commission with mandatory guidelines. Then the commissioners should have no vested interest about the districts, but where the incumbent politicians have a vested interest. They have a dog in the hunt. They want to get reelected. So that's some of the proposed reforms. Now, this next section I have to start with a warning, because we are about to enter the labyrinth of Ohio's guidelines designed to curb gerrymandering. There's a high risk that you may become disoriented and lost, never to return. Trying to explain Ohio's methodology for curbing gerrymandering has been one of my bigger challenges as a teacher, trying to make it understandable. So at this point, you might choose to turn back and say, I don't want to enter this labyrinth and get lost and get disoriented. But I hope if you choose that route, that at least you will take away from the preceding lecture that gerrymandering is not a good thing. It undermines the very principles of our country, and that you as a voter should insist upon legislators at least buying into the proposition that creating fair and equal districts is a good thing. And don't let them weasel around that. Get them to commit that gerrymandering is a bad thing. So here we are in Ohio. Ohio's Byzantine approach to redrawing legislative districts. Now they have created a redistricting commission, but they are political officers or nominees of those officers and not an independent group of citizens. So as it exists proposed right now in the Ohio Constitution, which had been amended, is we have a governor or designated or nominee, auditor, secretary of state, speaker of the House, president of the Senate, House minority leader, and Senate minority leader. So there's 7 members of the committee. The proposed map, after the census has been finalized, the proposed map of the new district must be adopted by September 1, 2021. And as a side note, it looks like Ohio is going to lose a congressional representative. They're going to go from 16 to 15. So this proposed map must be adopted by the commission by September 1, 2021, after at least 3 public hearings. No going into the bunker and coming out with it. You have to have public hearings, present what you're proposing, and have a chance for the public to react to those proposals. So there are mandatory guidelines for the commission. Contiguity and compactness, district boundaries should be created using county, municipal, and township boundaries. In other words, you shouldn't be splitting jurisdictions in various districts. You should stick to those boundaries. Where possible, House districts should not split counties more than once. I mean, they have split Cuyahoga County 3 or 4 times and done that. Hopefully the district population, each district population will not vary more than a few percent from every district having the same population. No maps that disfavor or favor one party over the other. And that the statewide proportional share of legislative seats should correspond closely to the statewide, state and federal partisan election results. And what does that mean over the last 10 years? Over the statewide elections, we know that a certain percentage is going to be Republican and a certain percentage is going to be Democrat. So that redrawing of these districts should reflect that split. So another requirement is they want to nest 3 contiguous House seats into each Senate district, and as I said before, at least 3 public hearings before adoption. Then they have this interesting aspect, which I find very intriguing, is submissions by the public is permitted. So in other words, you as an individual, if you're really good with computers, you can take those guidelines and come up with your own map. In fact, it's being proposed as projects in high schools and colleges of saying, come up with your own map. Here's the guidelines. Can you do better? And so when the commission or some other group, the politicians come out with their maps, you can say, well, wait a minute. You said you couldn't achieve that kind of balance, but look, Joe at Ohio State University sat down and created a map that's fairer than your map. How can you say you couldn't have done it? Because here it does. So it's going to be an interesting phenomenon to see these maps submitted by individuals. I, for myself, couldn't manipulate the data, but it'd be interesting to see what the really smart computer gurus can do. So that's an aspect that's quite different from other ones. So option 1, here's how we get redrawn through the commissioners. This would be the ideal way. The plan is approved if the vote of the commissioners is at least 4-3, with 2 members of minority party voting yes. So as you see in this schematic, you could have the governor, auditor, and the 2 House minority leader and the Senate minority leader voting yes on this plan. And they'd say, yeah, this is the plan we're agreeing to. If that happens, that's it. You don't have to go any further. The map with the new districts are fixed for 10 years until the next census. And the legislature can't fiddle with that map. Process is over. The commission has said this is how it's going to be, and that's it. The plan is not approved, however, if the vote of the commission is 4-3 and the the majority does not include at least 2 members from both major parties. So an example would be here, you could have the governor, yes, auditor, yes, secretary of state, yes, speaker of the House, yes, president of the Senate, yes, but you have the House minority leader, no, Senate minority leader, no. That would not be approved by the commission. So they have to have an alternative if that happens. They can't get agreement. Then you go to option 2. Now you're back to the drawing board. The proposed map must be adopted by September 15th by at least a 4-3 majority of the commission. So now the plan is approved if the vote of the commission is 4-3, and you don't need the votes of the minority party. So you could pass this, governor yes, auditor yes, secretary of state yes, speaker of the House yes, and the other ones are no. That would pass the commission. But what happens if that happens? What is the deterrence from doing that? If it's passed that way, the plan is only good for 4 years. So now you see the risk for the party that does it. In 4 years, the other party may control those commission seats, and now they can redraft the districts in a way that's sort of favorable to them, and that would be good for the next 6 years. So there is a certain encouragement to get it for 10 years, to get a plan for 10 years. Because otherwise you have to repeat the process again, and the commission must reconvene by July 25th, 2025. And that new map would be good for 6 years. So this is option 2A, and it only applies if the 2021 plan was approved by majority without the minority people agreeing. The convention, as I say, must reconvene by July 25th. It's only good for 6 years. They have to go through the other options. They have to try option 1 and see if they can get it that way. And if option 1 is unsuccessful, the map can be approved by option 2, which requires a simple majority, and it's good for 6 years. Those are for the Ohio House and Senate districts. There's a whole different regime for the districts for congressional representatives. The redrawing of districts for congressional representatives, the Ohio legislature did not want to give up its power to redraw those. So this is the scheme for congressional representatives. First of all, there's mandatory guidelines. 65 counties must not be split. In other words, of the 88 counties, 65 of them have to remain whole. Cities with less than 100,000 people cannot be split. So in other words, you can't split Lima into 2 districts. Cities greater than 100,000 people, but less people than an entire congressional district, cannot be split. So Ohio's 6 largest cities, only Columbus can be split because Columbus has more than 400,000 people. Dayton must not be split. In other words, you can't split Dayton into 2 different congressional districts. The district cannot be comprised of parts of 3 or more counties unless one of the counties has a population of 400,000. What does that mean? It just means you can't slice and dice one county into 3 pieces and put the 3 pieces in 3 different districts. And there must be an attempt to include at least 1 whole county in each congressional district. So, the procedural requirements. This map for the congressional districts has to be adopted by September 30th, 2021. They have to have 2 or more public hearings, none of this behind closed door business, and public submissions. They have to accept the public submissions, just like in the others. They need at least 60% of the House and Senate to approve the map. And at least in that 60%, at least 50% of the minority party votes in favor of the redrawn map. So an example would be you have 100 House members, 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats. To pass, it would take 60 or more votes in total, but at least 20 of those votes must be Democrats. If that's accomplished in the legislature, then you get a map that's good for 10 years. And again, the legislature can't fiddle with it again over those 10 years' time. That's the ideal. I mean, that would be wonderful to go that way. But if they can't agree, if option 1 fails,
it's back to the commission. They send it back to the commission, and the plan is approved if the vote of the commissioners is at least 4-3 with 2 members of the minority party voting again. So now again we're back, if you can get at least 2 members of the minority party voting for this along with others, you get a map that's good for 10 years. So the commission then weighs in and tries to get a 10-year plan. So they have to do it, have to adopt it by November 30th. They have to have public hearings again, public submissions again, and again the districts are fixed for 10 years until the next census. If the commission, I told you this was complicated, if the commission cannot agree, then it's back to the legislature, who has to adopt a plan before November 30th of 2021. So now it's back to the legislature. Different procedural requirements. Again, more public hearings, public submissions. At least 60% of the House and Senate approve the plan, but here's the difference. At least 1/3 of the minority party votes in favor of the redrawn map. You don't need 50%. So the example is if you have 100 House members, 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats, to pass you need 60 more total votes. At least 14 of those votes must be Democrats. If this happens, the map's good for 10 years. So that's a good thing. You've got 10 years for it to go. Option 4, if option 3 fails, the legislature can now approve the redistricting map by a simple majority vote if they adopt it before November 30th, 2021. What does that mean? Again, public hearings, public submissions. So you need at least 50% of the House and Senate to approve the map. There's no percentage of minority votes that are required. So if you have 100 House members, 60 Republicans and 40 Democrats, to pass you need 51 votes in total. Now they add another little wrinkle to this. If you go to this route, the legislature has to put out an explanation of how this map does not unduly favor one party or has undue community splitting and must attempt compactness. In other words, they have to explain in more detail of why they drew the lines the way they did and complied with the mandatory guidelines. Now that becomes important if this plan is ever reviewed by the Ohio Supreme Court. You know, how did they say they complied with the mandatory guidelines? And again, if this is the route taken for the map, then the map duration is 4 years. So if we go through option 4 is adopted, the legislature must go through the entire process again after 4 years in 2025 to approve the 6-year redistricting plan. So they now go back to square one on that, and all of this, of course, is reviewable by the Ohio Supreme Court. The hope is, with the mandatory guidelines, the public submissions, and that kind of data, the Supreme Court is going to be in a position to say whether or not these redistricting plans comply with the mandatory requirements. And so they can then say to the legislature or whoever, you got to go back to go. This doesn't do it. You got to try again. You didn't comply with these requirements, and so you've got to go back again. So that brought me, when I was doing this, to think about my mother's mantra that I grew up with. And she always said, if first you do not succeed, try again. And I think that mantra fits this methodology that Ohio has chosen to follow. Here's the gerrymandering, anti-democracy werewolf. Now, I am not much of a silver bullet person. I tend not to believe that there's one solution to solve a whole plethora of problems. But if I were in that camp, I would say that killing gerrymandering, basically killing the gerrymandering werewolf, would have a very, very beneficial effect on our democracy and would reestablish the principles about voting. The people control ultimately what the policies are going to be by the state. And
if you have a process of gerrymandered districts, what you will end up with over time is essentially like Russian democracy. Technically, people vote, but the same people get reelected all the time. And that is what gerrymandering achieves. So I hope that as a result of this conversation about gerrymandering, that you have a better understanding of gerrymandering and how it impacts on our democracy and undermines many of the principles we have about democracy. So you need to hold the legislators accountable. And of course, the first thing you need to do is to be sure you're registered to vote and that you vote. Thank you very much.